The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the luxury restaurant as Alexander Chen checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. The blind date his grandmother had arranged was already 20 minutes late, and his patience, already threadbare after a grueling week of corporate negotiations, was wearing dangerously thin. He was about to signal for the check when the restaurant door burst open, and instead of the sophisticated businesswoman he'd been expecting, a small figure stumbled inside, soaked to the bone and clutching a torn photograph in her trembling hands. The little girl couldn't have been more than 7 years old, her oversized raincoat dripping puddles onto the marble floor as her wide, frightened eyes scanned the elegant dining room until they landed on him. She walked straight to his table with the determined gait of someone on a mission far too heavy for her tiny shoulders, and when she finally stood before him, looking up with a mixture of hope and desperation that would haunt him for years to come, she whispered the words that would change everything he thought he knew about his carefully constructed life. "Are you Alexander Chen? My mom was supposed to meet you today, but she's in the hospital. She told me to come instead because she didn't want you to think she was rude. She said you might be able to help us." Alexander sat frozen, his champagne glass halfway to his lips, as this drenched child presented him with the crumpled photograph showing a beautiful woman with the same dark eyes as the girl before him. The restaurant fell silent around them, other diners turning to stare at this unlikely tableau, but the little girl seemed oblivious to everything except the man whose grandmother had promised her mother might be their last hope. Alexander had built his empire on quick decisions and calculated risks, but nothing in his MBA or his years climbing the corporate ladder had prepared him for the raw vulnerability in this child's gaze, for the way her lower lip trembled as she tried so hard to be brave, or for the crushing realization that somewhere out there, a desperate mother had sent her daughter into the unknown because she had run out of options. If you believe in the power of kindness, in the possibility of second chances, and in the small moments that can change everything, please like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel to hear more stories that celebrate the beautiful unpredictability of human connection. Your support means the world to us. The girl's name was Emma, and as Alexander listened to her explain in halting sentences between shivers that her mother had been in a terrible car accident 3 months ago and was now in the hospital again because of complications they couldn't afford to treat, he felt something crack open inside the carefully sealed chamber where he'd locked away his own painful childhood memories. He had been that child once, decades ago, standing in hospital corridors while his single mother worked 3 jobs to pay for his younger sister's leukemia treatments, watching her grow thinner and more exhausted until the day she collapsed and they lost everything anyway. He'd sworn then that he would never be powerless again, that he would build walls of money and success so high that pain could never reach him. But here was this little girl in her worn-out shoes and second-hand coat, demolishing 20 years of carefully constructed emotional barriers with nothing more than her honest desperation and her mother's faith that somewhere in this cold city there might still exist a human being who would care. Alexander found himself calling his driver, wrapping Emma in his coat that swallowed her completely, and heading to the hospital without consciously deciding to do any of those things. The story that unfolded in that sterile corridor while Emma waited in the children's area with a nurse was one that made his chest physically ache with recognition and rage at the unfairness of a world that could break people so thoroughly. Emma's mother, Sarah, had been a talented graphic designer until the accident that killed her husband and left her with injuries that required multiple surgeries. The insurance settlement had run out months ago, swallowed by medical bills and the predatory payment plans that trapped desperate people in cycles of debt they could never escape. Sarah had been managing on freelance work done from her hospital bed between treatments, but a recent infection had left her too weak to work, too sick to care for Emma alone, and too proud to ask for charity until Alexander's grandmother, who volunteered at a women's shelter where Sarah had briefly stayed, had mentioned her grandson's upcoming blind date, and Sarah had seen in it not romance but perhaps a business opportunity, a chance to pitch her portfolio to someone with resources, a desperate gamble that her talent might earn them a lifeline. When Alexander finally met Sarah, she tried to sit up despite the IV lines and the obvious pain, tried to maintain dignity while apologizing for sending Emma, tried to present her portfolio with shaking hands while explaining she wasn't asking for a handout but for a chance, just one freelance contract that might cover Emma's expenses while Sarah recovered enough to work properly again. The portfolio was genuinely impressive, her designs sophisticated and innovative, but Alexander barely saw them because he was looking at her eyes, at the same desperate determination he'd seen in Emma's face and in his own mother's eyes all those years ago when she'd begged doctors for payment plans and pleaded with landlords for extensions and finally, heartbreakingly, asked her 10-year-old son to be strong because she didn't know how much longer she could carry them all. He'd been so angry at her then for being weak, for not having money, for not being able to fix everything, and it had taken him years of therapy and success and distance to understand that his mother hadn't been weak at all, that she'd been the strongest person he'd ever known, and that the real weakness had been in a system that forced mothers to choose between their health and their children's futures. Alexander made a decision in that moment that his board of directors would later call reckless and his grandmother would call divinely inspired. He didn't offer Sarah a freelance contract. Instead, he hired her as the creative director for his company's rebranding initiative at a salary that made her cry and try to refuse because it was too much, too generous, certainly more than her portfolio alone could justify. He arranged for the company's premium health insurance to cover her immediately, called in favors to get her transferred to a better hospital with specialists who actually listened, and set up a trust fund for Emma's education that would ensure this little girl who'd walked into a restaurant with nothing but hope and a photograph would never have to sacrifice her dreams to medical debt. His CFO warned him about setting precedents and about how this looked like emotional decision-making rather than business strategy, but Alexander didn't care because for the first time in 20 years, he was making a decision not with his meticulously trained business mind but with the part of himself he'd buried alongside his mother and sister, the part that still remembered what it meant to be human and vulnerable and desperate. The weeks that followed revealed layers of complexity Alexander hadn't anticipated. Sarah was brilliant but also deeply traumatized, struggling with PTSD from the accident that had killed her husband and left her in chronic pain. Emma was mature beyond her years but also acting out in school, carrying anxiety and responsibility no child should bear. Alexander found himself not just writing checks but showing up, driving Emma to school when Sarah had early morning treatments, sitting in hospital rooms reviewing design concepts because Sarah worked better when she wasn't alone, attending parent-teacher conferences because Emma had listed him as an emergency contact and he hadn't had the heart to say no. His friends thought he'd lost his mind. His ex-girlfriend called him a fool for getting involved with someone who came with so many complications, but Alexander discovered something unexpected in the chaos of their lives. He felt more alive, more purposeful, more genuinely himself than he had in all his years of corporate success and carefully curated relationships. Sarah healed slowly, setback by setback, but her work transformed his company's brand identity in ways his previous marketing teams never had, bringing authenticity and emotional depth that resonated with customers tired of corporate polish. Emma gradually stopped having nightmares, started smiling more, even called him Uncle Alex one day in a moment that made him have to excuse himself to compose his emotions in private. The three of them became an unlikely family unit, not romantic despite what his grandmother kept hinting, but something deeper and stranger, bound together by that rainy night when a desperate mother had gambled everything on a stranger's kindness and a little girl had been brave enough to walk into the unknown carrying nothing but hope. 6 months after that first meeting, Alexander stood in the hospital room again, but this time it was for Sarah's final clearance from her medical team, the moment when they declared her recovered enough to transition to outpatient care and return to normal life. Emma was dancing around the room in excitement, chattering about the apartment Alexander had helped them find near good schools and Sarah's new office. Sarah herself was crying again, but this time with relief and joy rather than desperation, thanking Alexander for the 100th time in ways that still made him uncomfortable because he didn't want gratitude for doing what should have been basic human decency. What he'd wanted to tell her but didn't know how to express was that she and Emma had saved him just as much as he'd helped them, that their presence in his life had reconnected him with the person he'd been before grief and ambition had turned him into someone who measured worth in quarterly earnings and forgot that the most valuable things couldn't be quantified on spreadsheets. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that we all have the power to change someone's life with simple acts of compassion and presence, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and let us know in the comments about a time when someone's kindness changed your life or when you had the privilege of being that person for someone else. Alexander never did go on that blind date his grandmother had originally arranged, though he suspected now that the matchmaking had been less about romance and more about a wise old woman who knew her grandson had become too isolated in his tower of success and needed to remember what it meant to be part of the messy, complicated, beautiful tangle of human connection. Years later, when Emma graduated at the top of her class and Sarah's designs won international awards and Alexander himself was recognized not for his business acumen but for his philanthropic work establishing funds to help families facing medical bankruptcies, he would look back on that rainy night as the moment his real life began, the moment when a little girl's courage and a mother's desperate faith in human goodness had shown him that the most successful thing he could ever do was not build a fortune but build a family from the scattered pieces of broken dreams. Please comment below with a heart if you believe in the transformative power of showing up for others, even when it's inconvenient, even when it doesn't make business sense, even when all logic says to protect yourself, because sometimes the most illogical choice is the one that leads us home to ourselves. In the end, what the Millionaire CEO discovered on that blind date wasn't a romantic partner but something infinitely more valuable. He discovered that the walls he'd built to protect himself from pain had also locked him away from meaning. That true wealth wasn't measured in stock portfolios but in the trust of a child who called him family, and that the bravest thing any of us can do is remain open to being changed by the unexpected grace of strangers who show up in our lives asking not for salvation but simply for someone to see their humanity and choose to care.